Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video and myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War news update for the 19th of November 2024, and it is indeed, I think, the 1000th day of this war, which is a terrible landmark to achieve. I guess the Russians were thinking this war was going to be over just within 2 weeks because it wasn't supposed to be a war, it's a special military operation. And the Ukrainians thought after the initial months of the war that actually, with the wind behind their sails, that they could prevail in a relatively quick time period. Neither side was correct, and this has been a long and protracted war where allies have not quite supported Ukraine enough with the right kind of equipment at the right time in the sufficient quantities to bring this war to an expedited end, and therefore it has been long and protracted, and now we are at a very dangerous juncture where Russia is bringing in allies, Ukraine is perhaps losing allies as there is fatigue around the world and a change of political winds in the US. The decision to allow Ukraine to use ATACMS at a greater distance in Kursk has been met by the incoming administration entirely 100% negatively, including from Mike Walls, the incoming national security advisor. So it's not looking good on the American front, but it is an incredibly important time. It's going to be interesting to see whether Europe step up and take over. Now, from the Ukrainian General Staff figures point of view and all the usual caveats applied to these, we have some incredibly high numbers. Again, 1,610 personnel lost is very high indeed. 17 tanks is all pretty much double the daily average, and that's very high. 33 armoured personnel vehicles, well over the daily average. 46 artillery systems, over double the daily average there, so that's a very high number in that category. 120 vehicles and fuel tanks is almost a record there, and 17 pieces of special equipment is itself very high in that category too. We are still seeing sort of record averages of equipment, generally equipment lost at the moment. Really challenging for the Russians, there's no doubt about that. Andrew Perpetua has the daily stats out for the 17th, so this is 2 days ago. 95 personnel seen to have been killed in those videos, and we have a total of about maybe 4 to 1 Russian to Ukrainian losses. In terms of combat asset losses, about 1.5 to 1. Let's look at the Ukrainian losses. We have 2 radar systems taken out, counter battery radar of some sort in both cases, just unsure what it is. A boat destroyed, some artillery damage, M109 included. Then onto the tanks, 3 tanks, one of which is a damaged Leopard 2A4. Hopefully not too badly damaged, but that is a Lancet that's hit that. That can be very variable in the amount of damage it does, the Lancet. It can hit not very well, but also have different munitions, and so the explosions can be quite varied. Infantry fighting vehicles, 4 of those, including a damaged Bradley, a damaged Marder, and a destroyed Marder. So starting to see these Marders being used on a more frequent basis. That destroyed Marder was abandoned and then hit by Vandal drone. Vandal drone doing quite a good job at the moment for the Russians. Let's put that in, Vandal drone, Russia. See what comes up. Russia's jam-resistant fiber optic drone. Now, I don't know that is. I don't know if we have a good imagery of the Vandal drone. Controlled Vandal drone. That looks very different there. Let's have a look at this. Wow, so that looks to be the Vandal drone. A new Russian fiber optic controlled. So that is a fiber optic one, the Vandal. Interesting. Anyway, moving on. APCs, we have the usual culprits: M113s, Humvees, Striker, etc. Then a Kozak and IMV, generalized infantry mobility vehicle, unknown one damaged at the end there. So nothing too serious, although there is a Leopard 2A4 and Bradleys and Marders are on the list. I imagine the Americans, especially since they have announced another package imminently. That was announced at the UN, I believe. There is another package to come imminently, and I believe it is going to include armoured vehicles. I wonder whether they're going to give an absolute bucket load of armoured vehicles to Ukraine, Bradleys and similar. Now, when we go to the Russian losses, you can see quite a number of civilian vehicles there, loafs and motorcycles and cars and all sorts thrown into that category. A lot of these vehicles on the list forming quite a high proportion of the lost equipment. Then we have damaged Tor M2 air defense system. We saw that was a IED being dropped from a night vision drone. We have some electronic warfare equipment, a few bits of artillery, including M46, very, very old towed howitzer, and some D30s, almost as old. Tanks, then, we have the usual variety of tanks, including a tracked garden shed made from the T-72B, T-80s, T-62s, other tracked garden sheds as well. There's about 10 tanks on the list there, and about 9 infantry fighting vehicles, most of them BMP-2s and 3s, almost all of them destroyed. 100% the APCs destroyed, 4 of those, and an AFV damaged, unknown armoured fighting vehicle. And then trucks and ATVs. So it is a challenging list for the Russians, given the sheer volume of equipment they are losing on a daily basis. Also quite a few unknown bits of kit that have been so destroyed that it's difficult to tell what it is. Okay, then I shared this with you actually in the frontline update last night, but Russian low-level commanders. So remember I reported that the combined combined arms army had an issue with the commanders, low-level commanders, lying about what ground had been taken, what villages and towns might have been taken. That goes up the chain of command. Then you make decisions. You move into this area thinking that you control it, or you control the area to the north or the south or whatever, and you end up getting into trouble precisely because the commanders had lied. And as a result, a number of commanders have been fired, and there's been quite a few ramifications. The mill blogger community has got up in arms. The Russian sort of ultra-nationalists, cheerleaders for the war, have been remonstrating about this, and as a result, there's been a removal of some of these commanders, and that has happened, I believe, in the Bilohorivka area, also in the Kursk area. So this is Euromaidan Press reporting on this. Russian low-level commanders reported false claims to their military leadership about capturing 4 strategic villages in Kursk Oblast, which resulted in 2 Russian units being trapped without supplies or reinforcement options. And that could have been what caused this to happen. So Z channels report the disappearance of 60 soldiers from the 22nd Motorized Regiment in the Kursk region. And here are the missing in action. They are tearfully asking for Russian leadership to exchange them. 60 MIA is a, quote, serious concern. That is potentially a result of the incorrect data being spread amongst the command hierarchy, leading to garbage in, garbage out, bad decisions. Oh, didn't want to show that. Bloody, I paused that. Anyway, here we have, moving on from that, we have footage has emerged. I wasn't going to play it, but of an explosion in Sevastopol on November the 13th, targeting the car of 47-year-old war criminal, says War Translated here, Captain First Rank Valery Trankovsky. I reported this the other day, but it's just footage has come out now. Chief of Staff of the 41st Brigade of Missile Ships and Boats of the Black Sea Fleet. So this is a real high-level assassination of a Russian officer. Is going over a speed bump, this car, so I presume it's one of those kind of Mercury IEDs or whatever, where if the car goes on an incline, a slight incline, then there's a connection made between 2 points and the IED explodes. Anyway, that was a pretty big explosion taking apart that car. That's the partisan activity taking place in Crimea. There is news that as a result of these assassinations and similar activities taking place in Sevastopol, Simferopol and places, that the Russian Naval Command has moved out of Crimea down to Novorossiysk, including with their families, etc., etc. Okay, Moving on to distant strikes and another heavy night of Ukrainian drones in the Ukrainian skies. Their air defense shot down 51 of the 87 that were sent. 30 were taken out by electronic warfare, so that's 81. That leaves another 6. One drone was in Ukrainian airspace at the time of recording these stats, so that leaves potentially 5, maybe 6 hitting their targets. It's actually quite a large number compared to what we have seen. We've seen larger numbers than this fired into Ukraine, and 100% interception rate, and sometimes you get much smaller numbers and much higher numbers of drones getting through. It can be fairly variable there. Okay, so looking at the stats, and I have shown you these similar stats using Dell's statistics that are linked all the time on the description to this first video of the day, and here they are. The stats I show you with regard to cruise missiles and drones are the interception rates, and we can see the trends and the behavior of the Russians here. Well, this looks like a graph that shows, I presume, the intercepted missiles in blue, and in red the total number of missiles sent. And actually it's a very clear account of what has taken place since, well, not quite the beginning of the war, because we weren't really recording, or the Ukrainians weren't recording the missiles sent accurately in the first part of the war. So really you've got to start around this point here. That's October 2022. But you can see that there's been this really long period of stockpiling. So the question is, how many missiles have they stockpiled during this time period? Russian missile strikes in context. Sunday attack was the largest since the 29th of December 2023, 122 versus 120 missiles, and the second largest since September 2022. Although the overall interception rate was high, Kyiv claimed 85%, some missiles hit critical power infrastructure targets, which forced Ukrainians to implement stabilization blackouts in the most affected areas, primarily in Kyiv, Oblast, Dnipro, Petrovsk Oblast, Donetsk and Odessa oblasts. More importantly, Ukraine's largest private energy company, DTEK, said its thermal energy plants had suffered significant damage, which will likely have long-term consequences for the grid and Ukraine's power generation capacity. It remains to be seen whether this is the start of the third missile campaign aimed at the Ukrainian power grid, but given previous Russian behavior, it is likely that these strikes will continue. Intensity and regularity are big questions. The chart below clearly shows that Russians have been conserving and rebuilding their missile stocks for months. So the Sunday attack, while substantial, is unlikely to have exhausted Russian missile potential. Some people were saying yesterday to me that, hey, what about those strikes on the ammunition depots? But I don't think they hit cruise missile stocks at all. They would be held elsewhere. There might have been some North Korean ballistic missiles and whatnot stored. That there were some rumors of that. But I think in general, as far as cruise missiles are concerned, I don't think those stocks have been affected, and they've probably been fairly consistently building them. I don't know that they have been unable to build them due to sanctions or anything like that. I'd imagine, what happens if you, like I said previously, I think you've got a much greater density of missiles fired earlier in the war because they were using up their strategic stock, all their stockpiles that they had just in general from building them over decades and decades and not really being involved in wars that require huge amounts of cruise missiles and similar to be fired. And once they kind of used those initial stocks up, you had them firing them at the rate that they were producing them. And I think that's what you've seen. And if you kind of take this line here and then distribute it over this time period and take that line and distribute it over that time period and take those lines, you've got probably a fairly consistent number of missiles being fired on a month-to-month basis. Might have dropped marginally, but I think they're essentially building them and firing them. And these longer periods of stockpiling, I predict, would indicate that they are going to do a number of heavy wave attacks in quick succession. So I'd imagine over this next week or so, you will see attacks similar to what we saw 2 nights ago. but that's my speculation. Now, Naval report says Russia has around 300 Kh-101 cruise missiles in its arsenal as of November the 11th, so that's 8 days ago, according to intel sources. Some were used in recent attacks, so they used about 120 or 100 or so of those Kh-101 maybe, but production continues. Russia can reportedly manufacture 40 to 50 of these missiles monthly, and I think that probably hasn't changed too much. So they're just using them as they build them. Max24 saying similar here. Yeah, nothing extra in that one. Okay, now as far as strikes were concerned, last night, yesterday evening, and yesterday, the Russians continued striking into Sumy. Sumy seems to have been very much an emphasis for the Russians. It's reported by locals that after another strike on Sumy, bodies of a mother and child have been recovered from under the rubble in Kharkiv, 10 kilometers from the border with Russia. So Russian causing collapse of a front of a 5-story residential building is par for the course for the Russians, isn't it? They just seem to be hammering residential areas with wild abandon. Russia struck a dormitory in Kharkiv, Sumy region. Preliminary reports indicate 6 fatalities, including 1 child. 12 others were injured, among them 2 minors. So children are suffering. Now, also there are explosions in Zaporizhzhia, and half the city was without power again yesterday or yesterday evening. It looks like another energy structure had been hit then. You can tell by the very bright explosion there. Russian forces also launched a ballistic missile against the city of Odessa yesterday, killing and injuring people. And it seems like they might have hit a police station. So, quote, Russia treacherously aimed a missile into a residential building, an area of business activity, said the Mayor Trukhanov on Telegram. But there were a number of policemen who died in this. So in the attack, which killed at least 8, there's more now. I think maybe 11 have died. And injured 18, and now more. 2 residential buildings were damaged. It's reported another missile, which did not explode, hit an educational institution. And then Tim White here shows some more imagery of burning infrastructure. Pro-Russia channels are desperately alleging it was a Ukrainian air defense that was to blame for this strike on Odessa, which is fairly typical. And here we have Odessa imagery. Number of people killed is increased to 10. 7 of the dead are policemen and medics, and 2 local residents also died. Among 39 injured are 14 policemen. So I do think a police station was hit or similar. So here we have Tim later on saying in Odessa, photos have been released of the 7 police officers killed in Russia's attack. There's also the first picture of Odessa's agricultural university, which was hit by a falling missile ripping through the roof. In total, 10 died, 55 were injured. So a lot of these policemen. Okay, moving on. We have had, as a result of Odessa being struck, actually continually over quite a long period of time now, it's been a focus for the Russians due to it being a major export facility there for getting grain out down the grain corridor and out the Black Sea. So Odessa is incredibly important for Ukraine's economy. It's also culturally important. It's, I guess, a sense of morale. If you were to strike Odessa continually like they are, the Russians would be hoping to break the spirit of the Ukrainians, hit their morale. UNESCO, not for the first time, they've done this with Lviv and probably done it before with Odessa when that cathedral was hit in Odessa. Was it a cathedral? Anyway, UNESCO has condemned Russia's overnight strikes on Odessa's historic centre on the 15th, we're now the 18th, which damaged numerous architectural monuments, according to a statement on its official website. But, the international community, the UN, doesn't particularly give a damn, does it? Russian attacks across Ukraine killed at least 25 people and injured at least 79 over the past day. There's been a real uptick in civilian deaths, I think, in the month of October and into November. Children and police officers among the casualties, regional authorities reported today. And then we move on to the the Ukrainian ability to use ATACMS. Joseph Borrell from the EU's delayed statement confirms the US approval for strikes up to 300 kilometers into Russia. 80 and 300 kilometers there's a significant difference between those numbers, obviously, though missile supply remains limited, so they'll be used sparingly, but high-value targets are expected. Explosive developments are likely ahead, and indeed, there are claims that they were used last night. So Fabian Hoffman said, I published an op-ed with The Spectator on the anticipated effectiveness of ATACMS strikes on Russian soil and potential Russian responses. The argument goes like this. 1. The effectiveness of ATACMS largely depends on the quantity supplied. Although ATACMS has proven effective, Russia has shown a capability to intercept these missiles. This requires Ukraine to deploy large numbers of missiles to strike packages to ensure hits on aim points. Effectiveness of ATACMS strikes would be greatly enhanced if it coincided with Storm Shadow and Scalp-EG strikes. Dealing with a combined ballistic and cruise missile threat greatly complicates missile defense efforts and would force Russia to spread out its missile defense assets more widely. In response, Russia is expected to escalate grey zone measures, a process it has already begun, and intensify its missile campaign against Ukraine's critical infrastructure and civilian targets, which was going to occur regardless. And it could well be that the Ukrainians have already used ATACMS. There are reports that last night the Ukrainians struck an arsenal of the 1046th Logistics Center in Kharkiv, Bryansk region. According to General Staff, 12 secondary explosions and a detonation in the area of the target were recorded. Missile strike reported in the arsenal of Kharkiv, Bryansk region, and that has been confirmed by the General Staff and thought to be ATACMS used for the first time, according to RBC Ukraine. Citing sources, the blow was delivered to Kharkiv in the Bryansk region, which was successfully hit. We'll see if there's any any visual confirmation of damage done as that emerges over the next couple of days, without doubt. Now, the ATACMS use is obviously super important and great that the Ukrainians have been given that permission, but it's really frustrating, as Phillips O'Brien says here, that it seems the incoming Trump administration will not be supportive, as a response from the Trump camp has been entirely 100% negative. So this is, I don't know where, I think this is from his own Substack piece. The indications are coming thick and fast that those around Trump are very upset with the decision to allow Ukraine to fire ranged weapons into Russia, which makes it very possible that Trump dials this policy back not long after he becomes president. The chorus of those around Trump deriding this decision as dangerous include Elon Musk and Donald Trump Jr. So it's those with real influence, not the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and David Saxes of the world. Even more concerning, one of the few voices thought to be supportive of Ukraine, Mike Walls, was rather critical of the move yesterday. He claimed, quote, "This is another step up the escalation ladder and no one knows where this is going." What's really frustrating about this is you are giving Russia the red lines. This is one of my pet peeves. I was thinking in bed, I had a terrible night's sleep last night. I couldn't sleep. I don't know why. My mind was just going nuts till about 5 a.m. So I am done today. But one of the things I was thinking about is, like, with my limited knowledge of what's going on, admitted limited knowledge, I'm not privy to all the information these decision makers have, and therefore we criticize their decisions without knowing quite why they often made decisions. But given that caveat, what would I do differently? And things like, well, I would use much more operational security with my announcements, and I'd also not give Russia red lines that we set ourselves, that then they claim that we cross as allies. But Russia weren't the ones that set those red lines out. So we prevaricate and discuss and torture ourselves over whether Ukraine should be able to fire ATACMS 300 kilometers into Russia, thereby presenting this red line that we then eventually cross. We should never have had that discussion. It's just like, right at the beginning, yeah, of course you can use ATACMS 300 kilometers into Russia. Russia are the ones that are slamming stuff into your civilian infrastructure and your energy infrastructure. Of course you can go and do that. Bish, bash, bosh. It happens. And then it's just part of the war. But because we present these red lines, oh, we can't give you F-16s, oh, we can't give you F-16s, oh, we can't give you F-16s. Right, so now we presented an F-16 red line artificially. Right, Russia didn't say that. We said that. And then we present F-16s and Russia goes, oh, you provided F-16s. And so now you've got this change of nuclear doctrine that we'll talk about in a second that Russia rushed in last night as a result of this change of just a couple of 100 kilometers of the usage of missiles in one particular area. And Russia can use that. But they can use that precisely because people like Mike Walls here are saying, this is another step up the escalation ladder. You got the freaking Americans telling Russia that America has escalated. Do you know how freaking dangerous that is? Like, I was thinking, okay, Mike Waltz is going to be a good guy for Ukraine. He's fairly sensible on the Trump administration. But the first thing he flipping says is, we've escalated. You are doing the work of the Russians, you absolute tool bag. There's just nothing this incoming administration is doing is helping Ukraine in any conceivable way. Like, it's bad enough having bloody Jake Sullivan in the middle of the Biden administration going, oh, escalation. And then you've got his replacement coming in saying, you're worried about escalation? I'm telling you, Russia, we have escalated. You have every right now to send nuclear missiles in because we are admitting that we, as America, have escalated. I'm terribly sorry about that. So as Philip O'Brien says, so boil it down, and so far there's not a single voice close to Trump who has supported this choice. This does not automatically mean that Trump will suspend the policy, but it's hardly comforting. It's all so depressing. It's so depressing. Right, now, the outgoing administration, US Assistant Secretary of State Brian Nichols has confirmed that the US has allowed Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with American missiles without specifying it if this is only limited to the Kursk region. Quote, the weapons that President Biden has authorized Ukraine to use will give it greater ability to defend itself and hopefully will allow the Russian Federation to understand that the use of force to seize Ukrainian territory will not succeed, and perhaps it will begin to negotiate peace, or better still, simply withdraw from Ukrainian territory. So that's kind of the right sort of rhetoric that we want to hear, not from Mike Waltz. I just think Europe's got to go this alone. I think the US, we can forget the US. I mean, honestly, like, get those $7.1 billion of outstanding PDA and USAI assistance to Ukraine and just jettison the US. And do you know what? The US, sorry, guys, but you're not going to be part Five Eyes. You can take a running jump. You go and isolate yourselves and bury your head in the frickin' sand for 4 years, right? And let Russia run rampant. And that can be on your freaking heads, right? And Europe is going to have to pick up the slack, and they're going to have to up the ante here, because I don't think we can rely on the US in any way, shape, or form. And there's nothing that's being indicated at the moment that is good coming out of the incoming administration. Putin has approved an updated nuclear doctrine. So this is your classic nuclear saber rattling. They've done similar things to this before, with regard to other fake red lines being crossed. Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of weapons of mass destruction, which I guess is ATACMS, against it or its allies, as well as the event of aggression against it or Belarus involving conventional weapons. In other words, we're just giving ourselves permission to use nukes whenever the frick we want, really. On the approval of the fundamentals of the Russian state policy in the field of nuclear deterrence, the updated doctrine states that aggression by any non-nuclear state supported by a nuclear power will be seen as a joint attack on Russia. So on and so forth. Now, we have a new thread from Carl, Michael Weiss giving that here. Carl is, I do believe, a Estonian intelligence analyst. Scare quotes Carl, as in he's anonymous, but he gives really good analyses every once in a while, and this is the first one since the election. So let's go and look into what Karl says. Russia is pushing hard on 2 to 3 fronts. On the Kursk front, they have managed to gain control over a third of the territory occupied by the Ukrainians. I don't see Russia being able to push Ukraine out of Kursk within the year or by the time Trump takes office. Their pace of progress is slow everywhere on the front. The second front where Ukraine continues to struggle is the southern part of the eastern front from Pokrovsk to Vuhledar. There, Ukraine's progress is happening continuously, even if it is slow. I presume that means Russia's progress. In the worst weeks, Ukraine loses up to 20 square kilometers there, but on average 5 to 6 square kilometers per week. It is a small number, but when it happens week after week, it becomes psychologically uncomfortable for Ukraine. This is exactly what I said before. It's like, yeah, it's not too much a worry. Yeah, it's not too much a worry, but cumulatively, it is significant over a long period of time if you can't see any way of getting that back militarily. On the Kupiansk front, on the northernmost part of the eastern front, there is also a certain Russian pressure. Their diversionary groups sometimes reach somewhere briefly, but it doesn't mean the area is under their control. The pressure there is not as strong as on other fronts. That's interesting and might give you a little bit more hope when you look at Surat maps, just saying, oh, the Russians got here, therefore they control it. Actually, Karl here is saying that's not always the case. Ukraine was expecting a major missile attack, and it happened 2 nights ago. Based on initial assessments, the results are not as bad as feared. Ukraine's interception rate was very good. Out of 120 missiles, fewer than 20 got through. Of 8 Kinzhals, 7 were shot down, and not all of them were aimed at Kyiv. So that's interesting because that's what I was wondering. I said that it's likely they're all aimed at Kyiv because that's a really good interception rate and of Kinzhals. And if they weren't aimed at Kyiv, then that's interesting because it means that that Ukraine have either SAMT or Patriot PAC-3s positioned outside of Kyiv and other places. That means they have a pretty good or an improving spread of anti-air ballistic missile capability. And that's exactly what Karl says here. So Ukraine's air defense capabilities seem to have geographically expanded. The energy, sometimes I say this as though to clap myself on the back, but it's only because I'm not confident in my own analysis because I'm not an expert. I'm just some guy interested in the philosophy of religion has ended up banging on for 2.5 years about war, but I'm no expert. So when I do say things that seem sensible to me and end up being said by people who are far more knowledgeable than me, I'm like, yay! I'm not a douche. The energy infrastructure was hit last night, but not as badly as feared. The energy infrastructure. Not as badly hit as feared, but during such attacks, electricity usage is limited anyway. But normal power supply has been restored already within a couple of hours in Kyiv and Dnipro. Russia's success rate with drone attacks has already become very low. Out of 100 drones on average, only 5 to 6 make it through. The rest are either shot down or neutralized with electronic measures. I do also wonder, because we are hearing that a number of these attack drones are actually decoy drones. Those that do get through might not be ones with warheads as well. So they might just hit their target, but just go, or they might be mapping drones that hit their scapegoat's target. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, there is nothing particularly significant for Ukraine at the moment. Russia has 2 clear directions elsewhere. 1, trying to reclaim Russian territory, and 2, taking full control over the Donbass. In Donetsk Oblast, there is no significant pressure toward Kramatorsk or Sloviansk. The Russians are stuck near Chasiv Yar. Russia's limited successes in the southern part of the eastern front. What happened at Avdiivka, where Russia made significant advances after the town fell, has not repeated at Vuhledar. Near Vuhledar, Ukraine's retreat continues, but it is a controlled retreat. Interesting, that's his interpretation, because I think they are losing quite a lot of ground there. And some significant fortifications have been lost there. So, but the idea is that, okay, it's not that they're not losing fortifications; it's that they're doing it in a controlled manner. Whereas Avdiivka wasn't. It was not quite a rout, but it was a bit of a disaster. Politically, Trump's victory is a big topic, but unlike in Western Europe, it's not seen as a tragedy in Ukraine. Interesting. They were not supportive of Harris either. Biden-Sullivan's inaction and extreme caution on Russia left Ukrainians quite neutral in the US elections. Trump at least has a certain capability for surprises and forceful actions towards Russia as well. Ukraine's fear was that a Harris administration would be similar to Biden's. They would not act differently. I was hopeful that that wasn't going to be the case, and we seem to have stronger people coming in. Philip Gordon, even Mark Kelly and people were sounding pretty decent. So I personally, from my point of view, I was confident that Harris would have been stronger than Biden. I'm just absolutely devastated that literally everyone in the Trump administration seems to be anti-Ukraine for some annoying reason. Trump's unpredictability is also shown in his cabinet picks alongside civilized figures like Rubio and Walz. But again, like we just heard, Walz has just essentially given the Russian propaganda line. So even that good choice is not good by the looks of it. Civilized figures like Rubio and Walz. There are also Gates and Gabbard. That says it all. Now Hegseth has also joined the list. As Politico USA's headline put it, who the F is this guy? Paradoxically, Harris's loss is beneficial for Ukraine. Biden is now motivated to deliver the aid that was already being decided. So that is indeed an interesting point. So that $7.1 billion gets delivered really quite quickly, and a lot of it, and they'll get a load of stuff. Otherwise, there would have been delays. Now the pace of aid delivery is accelerating. Ukraine's situation should also ease because weather conditions in the next 2 to 3 months will become cloudy. That will reduce Russian Air Force activity and the use of guided glide bombs. Air Force activity is expected to drop 2 to 3 times during these months. This will somewhat ease Ukraine's situation on the front. Scholz's call to Putin certainly does not benefit Ukraine, Europe, or Germany. Scholz himself believes it benefits the Social Democratic Party in Germany. Sole purpose of the call could be to rally left-wing voters of the Social Democrats, for whom the term peace is a sacred concept in itself. That's interesting point, because actually lots of people have been ragging on Scholz from across Europe for that call, and it's not been seen as particularly beneficial to Ukraine, and it's not been a popular decision to have done that. But I think it's more about domestic politics, exactly as Carl here says. I don't believe he is foolish enough to think he can achieve results by talking to Putin. In the call with Scholz, Putin reiterated that his goals remain the same as 2 to 3 years ago. Putin referred again to the ultimatum from December 2021. There was no valuable information in the call. What was interesting in that call is that, as it's come out, and I was going to report in my geopolitics video, that actually Putin's position hasn't changed. So if we learned anything from that call is Putin isn't really ready for negotiations, and he's still kind of got maximalist ideas for this whole conflict. The CDU's Friedrich Merz could potentially establish some personal contact with Trump. The question is, what kind of coalition will emerge in Germany after the elections? There are several questions there. Will Scholz even run as SPD's chancellor candidate in the elections, or would it be someone like Defense Minister Boris Pistorius? So there is talk about Pistorius running, says Carl. He is 5 to 6 percentage points more popular than Scholz, but Pistorius has never been high in the party's internal hierarchy before becoming Defense Minister. He was not involved in federal politics. From Ukraine and transatlantic cooperation's perspective, Scholz's disappearance would be welcome, but it's not the only problem. While Macron-Trump relations are decent, Keir Starmer has openly endorsed Harris, and Trump will not forget that. I don't know that he openly did, actually, but it was pretty obvious. Starmer has also made UK support for Ukraine more cautious. Johnson and Sunak were willing to bypass Biden, but Starmer is doing everything in lockstep with the Americans. The Brits no longer take the lead ahead of the USA. I think that might change, though. I think that you're going to get a Tusk, Starmer, Macron triangle with perhaps Germany in there as well. I have a feeling things are on the change for Europe. Russia's interest rate is 21% and rising. There's brutal pressure on Nabiullina in the Russian media. So she's head of the Treasury, I think, or she has so far been the voice of reason in Russia's macroeconomic management. I welcome it if Russia started printing more money. There are claims that they printed. So I need to look at confirmation of this. This is only Jay in Kiev quoting from the Moscow Times, but Russian central bank to print, what is that, 100 trillion rubles? Dollars, it says there. 100, that's billion, that's 100 billion, sorry. $100 billion to bail out the state's banks. So that could be hugely significant. Current Defense Minister Belousov has always believed that If there is no money, they should print more. Putin himself has some instinctive opposition to this. He knows where it led in the late 80s. That's why he's always resisted the pressure. Russian reserves are shrinking. They should run out within the next year. If something resembling hyperinflation begins and interest rates remain so high that people cannot take loans, Russia will face problems. For now, they do not seem to have any other problems, though. There is no political force with enough energy and strength to change anything. The opposition abroad is a political joke and totally infiltrated by the FSB. Among them, they are certainly brave. There are certainly brave individuals risking their lives, but as political players, they are hopeless. What to watch in the coming weeks and months: frontline progress, allied financing of Ukraine, and how Trump pushes his peace proposals forward. These are the most important issues. Even if we'd accept that a ceasefire will have to happen, there is no way to do it while Russia is advancing on a front. Russia might start considering a ceasefire if they feel that without making peace, the conditions ahead will worsen. Anyone who doesn't understand this cannot do simple maths. So it's going to be interesting to see whether hyperinflation is on the horizon. That's never a good sign for an economy, is it? But yeah, need some confirmation there. Ukraine's economy, on the other hand, so this Ukraine's economy grew by 4.2% year on year to the first 10 months. In the first 10 months of 2024, thanks to the construction, transportation and manufacturing sectors, the country's economy ministry said yesterday. And finally, Great Britain apparently convinced Ukraine to start up an operation on the left bank of Dnipro River in Kharkiv in 2023, according to, I guess that's Ukrainska Pravda. The maximum task was the departure of the Ukrainians to the border with Crimea. So getting across the Dnipro River in Kherson, getting to Kharkiv, getting a bridgehead and getting all the way to Crimea. But of course, as we know, it only stayed in Kharkiv. Now, the minimum task was to expand the bridgehead on the left bank and cut the M14 highway, and never got to do that, although it sort of had some fire control over that for a bit. But it stayed in Kharkiv. Now, the end result is that it was beneficial to the Ukrainians, but it was... I think I said at the time that I think they planned to expand that as a bridgehead and go out and do X, Y, and Z. In the end, it was just this bait the Russians. So the Russians were attracted to come and flush them out of Kharkiv with all sorts of personnel and equipment, and that allowed the Ukrainians and Magyar's birds from the other side of the Dnipro to absolutely hammer the Russians. So the Ukrainians lost troops there. But compared to the Russians, it was a cost that was well worth taking. I think that's how the Ukrainian command would have seen it. The Russians lost tremendous amounts of stuff around Kharkiv, but it's interesting that A, it was supposedly the British that convinced them to do this, and B, the initial intentions were well beyond what the Ukrainians were able to achieve. They were never going to get to Crimea, and actually they struggled to get out of Kharkiv. Really, there are a couple of places that they did get a foothold for a bit, but getting across that river while the Russians got artillery and drones themselves was always going to be difficult. Anyway, interesting stuff. That's enough from me. Thank you for listening. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.